Hi everybody and welcome to the Primogen's Library, the very first episode of it in fact, where I, the Primogen, will be reviewing some older Vampire the Masquerade and World of the Darkness books. Why older, you might ask? Well, it's simply because I feel like older books are slightly less known today, and if you're a new player to Vampire the Masquerade, you might be thinking, what should I be getting from the Storyteller's Vault or Drive-Thru RPG to, learn more about this stuff? So I will be reviewing books, giving obviously very subjective accounts of how I felt they were. And to help me with that, I've devised a very foolproof system of 5 different scores. These scores are lore, crunch, player and storyteller usability, as well as overall impression. And lore, obviously, is going to be how good is this book in teaching me new stuff about Vampire the Masquerade or World of Darkness? Is it rehashing a bunch of stuff I already know? Or is it giving me new insights into storyteller player characters or, aspects of the Jihad or the Gehenna Wars that I didn't know about before? That kind of stuff. And crunch is going to be, are there cool new abilities in here? Like, I'm no expert on disciplines, obviously I've said that before, but like, what's new in this book? Can I get new powers, alternative rules for Diablerie, I don't know, stuff like that. Player usability is going to kind of continue on that trend, like how useful is this book for a player? Now, as we all know, it's much easier to be a storyteller than a player, because as a storyteller, you will find players, not vice versa. So, player usability, is there stuff in this book that I can use for my character? Is there stuff that can help me play my character better? Is there stuff that helps inspire me, to make a better character? Stuff like that. Is it useful to me as a player? On the other side of that coin is it useful to me as a storyteller? Are there cool inspirations for villains, bad guys, allies, heroes for the players? Can I build a chronicle based on the stuff that I learn in here? Can I give cool powers to my villains for the players to face? Will I, as a storyteller, know more about the secrets of the World of Darkness after reading this? So that's going to be a criteria as well. And finally, the overall impression is just, what did I think about the book in general? What did I think about the art, the editing, the tone? Does it mesh well with the rest of the World of Darkness? Or is it, that redheaded stepchild that's just weird and doesn't fit in? Yeah, so that's going to be my 5 criteria. I'm rating them from 1 to 10. So again, obviously, this is a very subjective video. And if you don't agree with my opinions, you're perfectly fine to tell me in the comments. I will be reading them and, try to answer most of them, and if I get stuff wrong, absolutely let me know. But this is not a lore video, this is not a this is how it is, this is how I perceive it. And the first book I will be reviewing is Sins of the Blood. You might not see all of the cover because I have a green screen behind me and my camera thinks that they're roughly in the same color. Sins of the Blood is a book you guys voted on for me to review, although of course I listed it, and I will read from the back of it, so we will kind of know what this book is about. It's also, by the way, written in 2001, and that's pretty much peak vampire, so might be good, might not be good, who knows. Take 2. Sins of the Blood. Even the damned have taboos. The rules of the kindred are many, varied, and Byzantine. No 2 princes interpret the traditions alike. One bishop's treason may be another's valor. Still, even in such precarious societies, heresies arise and sometimes flourish. From foul diablerie to inhuman codes of morality, some kindred shock the sensibilities of their fellows. Sins of the Blood includes guidelines for diablerie, Golconda, and other uniquely canine conditions. New paths of enlightenment and mystical kindred powers. Sins of the Blood includes, apparently, information on playing such heretics and hunting them. Sounds pretty cool. So we'll get into this book right now, and I will give you a rundown of what the book is about, and then we will go to the scoring. See you in a bit. It becomes immediately clear when reading the introduction to Sins of the Blood, a source book released in 2001, 10 years after the first edition of Vampire the Masquerade, that this book is set firmly in the revised era of vampire. Straight away we are told about monstrous kindred and canites who indulge in their bestial nature, the complexities of the 2 larger sects, and the author waxes poetic about what it means to be truly evil, if there even is such a thing. There are some strong contenders for that definition in the World of Darkness, and while I appreciate the emphasis on how our deeds, just as much as our mindset, defines us, it feels a little bit like splitting hairs. We've seen the Bali, Nafandi, and the Black Spiral Dancers at this point, so you would definitely need to work within the realms of vampire morals to try to drive home a point about how there are grades of damnation they may condemn their souls to. But to give the authors credit, they do say that the heresies presented in this book are intended to be rare, plot elements for a storyteller to resort to should they need to expand their collection of antagonists, but also they may be player options as well. It's always interesting to compare the many different editions of Vampire, and I think this really encapsulates the trend at the time. Most players had grown used to and bored with playing newly embraced neonates clinging to their lost humanity, and this offered up some variety in the gameplay, even if it meant playing as utterly inhumane monsters. Chapter 1, The Sins of Morality, starts with a text to sort of set the mood for the chapter, talking extensively about morals and the loss or gain of humanity, yet the framework of it all feels a little bit routine by now. The narrator is ancient, although exact age unknown, and it is heavily implied through this text that he is a true bruja, which feels fitting for the subject as they struggle with expressing emotions, and even just caring about what happens around them. He goes on to explain just what it takes for a vampire to embark on a path of enlightenment. The book discusses the differences between a Sabbat and a Camarilla adherent to a path, and how either may come to be, which is some useful insight into both lore and advice on how to roleplay, as Path of Enlightenments are some of the hardest aspects to get right in this setting. It requires sitting down to study a moral code that might diverge strongly from the humanity we all follow. Thus, this book does its best to explain not only how a follower of a path should act around other kindred, but also lists them, explaining which would be easier to pull off in the Ivory Tower. The book is fairly thorough in giving an overview of these paths, both what they are about, but also how likely it would be for them to be taught to an outsider, in the case of a clan-specific path. Mind you, this book only provides the rules for 3 new Paths of Enlightenment. For the others, you will need either the core rulebook or whatever supplement covers those. The 3 new paths are the Path of the Scorched Heart, the Path of Self-Focus, and the Path of Harmony. I feel that this is perhaps the weakest part of the chapter, if not the book, as none of these 3 paths evoke much inspiration in me. They are all of them fairly moderate, and reflect behaviors and patterns I wouldn't be surprised to see in a human, although the Harmonist is described almost like someone chaotic neutral. Sure, I may feed gently on a vessel for weeks, but then I might randomly tear out her throat because of balance. At this point in the setting's life cycle, a lot of players were experimenting with paths, and they had radically mutated from the weird and twisted ways of the Sabbat, where they were introduced, into these varied ways of looking at mortals, vampires, and the world. Yet I don't get much of an alien feel to these 3. The Path of the Scorched Heart is literally observe everything going on around you dispassionately. Self-focus is know thyself and your limits, and harmony is balance in all things. There's a vampiric touch to all of it, of course, but they come across as much more moderate than many of the older paths, and they kind of clash with the title of the book a bit. Especially when the 8th step of the Path of Self-Focus is essentially a rephrasing of the very human golden rule of treating others as you would want to be treated. At this point, you may as well go with humanity. I'm being a bit hyperbolic, absolutely, but the hierarchy of sins for the Path of Harmony likewise is vague and difficult to interpret. The 4th step is acting too human or too bestial, for example. How does one determine what is too human and too bestial? And judging from some of the low-tier sins, such as feeling guilty about killing when necessary, or refusing to kill when necessary, this path feels like a cheap cop-out for someone who doesn't want to be human, but still, not have as much of a challenge role-playing as Path of the Night or Metamorphosis, for example. They all fit neatly into the dispassionate, cool observer personality, which I'm assuming will appeal to some players. To me, they feel too tame and too close to personalities rather than moralities. I guess if your group is dead set on playing a Sabbat pack, this might provide some kind of decent middle ground for players who aren't comfortable exploring some of the pretty out there paths. Moving on. One of the more interesting facets of this book is the detail it goes into explaining the nature of wights, vampires who have succumbed completely to the beast and have become mindless predators. To my recollection, I don't think this is a topic that's often covered, and it goes into detail talking about how wights may use disciplines, how they hunt, and conversely how to hunt them, providing a section for storytellers who may want to or have to include them in their game. Finally, this chapter also provides some interesting insight into Golconda, detailing the challenges one may face and the dangers of losing their way. There are little to no mechanics involved in this segment, which I think is a plus, because something like Golconda, at this point in the setting, is mythical and extremely rare to find. Previous editions, especially the first, would be more blatant about its existence and how to achieve it, but in Revised it had evolved into something just a bit more than a vampire fairy tale. If you're planning on going down that path, this book will provide some insight into the process, but I wouldn't say it's crucial knowledge. Most of it could be deduced just by having what is described in the core rulebook. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 doesn't start out great. On the very first page there is not only a rape comparison, which feels extremely out of place, but then also a blatant and extremely racist stereotype being used as well. There's also the fact that this chapter is written from an omniscient narrative perspective, meaning you can't blame these phrasings on some in-game character. It's the narrator themselves using the terms. The tonal shift from the previous chapter is really strong and honestly left me a bit baffled. I can, I guess, imagine the decision on the book's language, seeing as this is supposed to be about vampiric sins and debauchery, yet I can't help but feel that the author writing this chapter tried very hard to get across the casual detachment effect on the reader, which feels a bit blasé to me. The second chapter focuses on sins in the vampiric society in itself. It starts out with autarchus, the vampires belonging to no sect, continuing through anarchs, sect switchers, and finally Diablerie. The part about the autarchus puts a lot of emphasis on kindred forced into sectlessness, rather than those who make this transition by choice. It wraps this in a narrative of the 7 deadly sins, which, while poetically interesting, is a little bit of a heavy-handed metaphor for how this works, but I guess it's sufficient as a vehicle to get the point across. I find it a bit strange that there's writings on ex-Sabbat autarchus as well, as some of the sins described would, in my book, hardly be punished in that sect if there's enough strength to back it up. It also talks very little about vampires who, like Beckett, Anatole, or Lucita, have chosen this lifestyle themselves, and it even goes to describe how, at best, autarchus are considered persona non grata amongst Camarilla. Yet we have seen evidence that the situation is not quite as clear-cut, and I find myself thinking that this chapter doesn't mesh well with the pre-established lore regarding autarchus, as it focuses almost solely on the outcasts, rather than those who have chosen to remain outside the sect's nightly affairs by their own volition. There's another unfortunate comparison in this book here as well, relating the Camarilla's treatment of some autarchus to how the Nazis treated Jewish people in the 1930s. Yeah. No comments. The part about anarchs and how they are perceived by either sect offers plenty of insight into it, as well as what I consider the general view of anarchs in the revised edition. Camarilla Light. Filled with blue-eyed fledglings fighting for mortal values and in way over their heads. I don't blame the authors for this, it certainly to me seemed to be the predominant view on this faction in the revised edition. Even so, there's nothing in here that I consider not meshing with the lore at the time. The Camarilla despise the Anarchs for their audacity and demanding equality, and the Sabbat hate them because they're demanding freedom, yet doing no work to get it. Likewise, when the book goes on to explain how or why a sect member may decide to leave their current for another, it checks out and provides some interesting insight that can be used in the game. It's a good source for lore and can function well for a player who wants to justify their character abandoning the Camarilla way for the Sabbat, for example, but overall there isn't a lot in this chapter that isn't extrapolations you can draw from reading other materials like the guides to the sects and such. At no point reading this did I feel like I was learning something new, but on the other hand it can prove a useful summation of these things to be handed to a new player who's not well read up on the topic. Finally, the second chapter discusses Diablerie and how it is perceived in the Camarilla and the Sabbat. I've found this a refreshing read, and again, while it's certainly not something a veteran of the setting would find mind-blowing, it serves as a good summary of what the sect and some of their factions think about the Amaranth. Anyone looking for new rules or abilities based on what is told in this chapter will have to look elsewhere though. There are no new backgrounds, merits, flaws, or expanded rules on Diablerie here, Most of what that would entail could already be found in other books anyway. Chapter 3, Sins of Discretion, reads very much like a guide on how to identify and form a cult. Quite a bit of research seems to have gone into this chapter, and that shows. Starting with instructions on how to spot them, then continuing on to explain what cults may offer their true believers, until finally digging into several real-life examples of cults, mainly from only a few years before the writing of this book. It's interesting to note just how casually Asahara, the founder of the Aum Shinrikyo, is alleged to be a vampire and apparently have some ulterior motive behind the founding of his cult, besides gassing 200 people to death in the Tokyo metro. Yeah, they literally say that he was a vampire in this book. It leaves a bad taste in my mouth, and I can't help but compare this section to the upcoming Cults of the Blood Gods, which managed to cover the same topic, but without involving the Order of the Solar Temple and their mass suicide pact. Sure, there are cults similar in this regard, yet the new writers wisely decided not to capitalize on the shock value of recent real-world events to sell their books. Imagine writing in how a school shooting was actually all a Sabbat plot to weaken the Masquerade before a siege on the Camarilla, and they would be using real-life examples to illustrate it too. I'm not really a fan of this line of thinking. This is a really difficult chapter to discuss, as I believe large parts of it are extremely useful for both storytellers and players looking to get into making cults. It's very matter-of-factly and talks about many facets of starting and running a cult that could make for an entire chronicle's worth of content. But ultimately, I find it disturbing and in bad taste that they consistently use real-world examples when made-up ones might have worked just as well. In terms of information, this chapter is probably the highlight of the book, and while I haven't read State of Grace, I can only assume this book takes on a more cynical view of faith and organized religion than that one does. The fourth chapter of this book, Sins of Power, is focused almost exclusively on crunch. It presents dark thaumaturgical paths, rituals, Koldunic sorcery, and Banu Hakim blood sorcery, as well as a few supernatural themed merits and flaws. Right away, the book says that it's entirely up to the storyteller's discretion whether they would allow these disciplines or not, which honestly should be extended to the rest of the group as well, in regards to some of what's presented here. One particular path of dark thaumaturgy allows the vampire to send victims into orgasmic comas, for instance, while another allows the user to turn a victim into a perverse sin fiend actively seeking to rape, murder, and torture others. Yeah, there's also that ritual of forced abortion, terminating a pregnancy at any state, which I'm sure would see a lot of use in your typical chronicle. Snide remarks aside, this part of the book does live up to its title. These are all really dark, evil, and twisted powers that damn the souls of whoever is using them. Some of them seem a little niche, with effects you might as well use another power for, ones that don't damn you, but others provide clever and interesting takes on the powers that demons can provide a character with, at a cost. Cankerous Blossom, a 5th level discipline, requires you to catch someone in an act of perversion so that you can literally turn their debauchery into cancer that eats up their bodies, which feels a little situational to me. You'd probably have an easier time offing someone with another power that doesn't require catching them in a compromising and morally dubious situation. But it does work on path users. I feel like I should point out that I don't personally have any problems with powers of this kind being presented in a game like Vampire, although obviously with everyone's consent in mind. I mean, I play Cult. The difference between this chapter and the one before is that Chapter 3 actively interprets recent real events and sort of undermines the very real horror of them by blaming it on vampires. There's a reason World War II, Hitler's rise to power, and Stalin's purges weren't because a mage told them it would be a good idea. Humanity does a really good job of being its own monster. But anyway, back to the chapter. While a lot of stuff presented here is obviously very dark, the game doesn't refrain from telling you that, yep, you're definitely selling your soul by using these powers. It's going to erode any humanity you have left, and even a lot of paths would find these powers questionable at best. Thus, this stuff you save for the truly depraved, twisted creatures that, honestly, better belong as SPCs to be fought than amongst players, but your mileage may vary. This kind of stuff would probably fit better with a Black Dog label, at least some of it, and I would strongly recommend that the entire group playing specifically get to sit down and voice their opinion on the content before a storyteller brings this stuff to the table. The thaumaturgical path presented in this book are the Path of Pain, which deals with inflicting or removing pain. The Path of Pleasure, inflicting unbelievable ecstasy or deadening someone to any kind of sensation. The Path of the Defiler, focusing on degrading others and bringing out or creating strange obsessions and desires in their victims. Path of the Unspoken, dealing with knowledge usually unobtainable without infernal help. And finally Path of Pestilence, which is centered around diseases and plagues. There are also thaumaturgical rituals involved, some equally nefarious as the paths, and one even allowing for multiple kindred to reap the benefits of diablerizing another kindred. These rituals, in my opinion, would all serve as much more interesting plot points for a game than something readily available in a player's arsenal. Just consider the implications of a group of neonates tasked with tracking down a coterie of dark thaumaturgists who have been systematically hunting down kindred of lower generations to diablerize them. What would the coterie do if they found out how the ritual worked? There are also Koldunic and Banu Hakim rituals as well, some significantly less malicious than the paths, although there are, again, some cool powers to focus a story or even a whole chronicle around. There is the ability to bind a demon to a recently deceased neonate's corpse, or to render a kindred's vitae impotent in siring new vampires. Finally, the merits and flaws are, well, very specifically centered around holy and unholy powers. One of them, at a sufficient level, would essentially give your characters cloven hooves and vestigial wings. Interestingly, there is a flaw here that forces the player to roll to resist desires only with the willpower they have remaining, rather than the maximum of their pool, which seems surprisingly similar to how a willpower roll would work in V5. The last chapter of the book, or rather the Appendix, provides some interesting adversaries, or even allies from the World of Darkness. This chapter is very interesting to me and provides an amusing read as it discusses everything from professional lawyers helping dark thaumaturgists get the most out of a deal with the actual devil, to a cult formed around a single ex-Sabbat who calls himself the Cold Man. This part of the book, in my opinion, is by far the best content, and it provides quirky yet fascinating stories, even if the recent ventures of the so-called Thrill Kill Club feels a bit on the nose. At least they're scalping people who murders minorities, so that's something. Overall though, this chapter feels a bit more frivolous than much else of the book's content, and is refreshingly fun to read. I feel like the Cults of the Blood Gods definitely got some inspiration from some of these outlandish stories, and even if they are tongue-in-cheek, I could definitely see my players running into the Darwin Society, the ultimate vampire survivalists playing on both sides on the Camarilla-Sabbat War, or the Tapestry, kindred whose fingerprints are replaced with minuscule recreations of ancient texts of vampiric knowledge upon their embrace. Welcome back. So, as you probably heard, I have some opinions about this book. We're gonna go through the scoring very soon, but right away I can say this is not my favorite that I've read so far, and hopefully the next book in line, The Chaining of the Beast, will be more about the darker sides of vampires, unlike Sins of the Blood, which apparently isn't. Anyway, let's go through the scoring. Lore. What do I feel about the lore? This book covers a lot of ground. Right away we can tell that this book has a lot of information that it's trying to explain anyway. And unfortunately that means it's very shallow as well, at least in my opinion. I've read a lot of vampire books, obviously, so my perspective may be a little bit skewered, but I would say that most experienced vampire players will not get a whole lot of new information lore-wise out of this book. It's, on the other hand, a very good book to give to someone who's relatively new to the setting, but needs to read up to play a slightly older character if that is the occasion. Anansile, for example, being played by a new player, would possibly know about Diablerie and Golconda and things like that, but the players might not. So this is a good way to kind of quickly summarize some of the core concepts of, the more complex core concepts of Vampire Society anyway. That being said, I think if we didn't have the Appendix, which provides some really interesting stuff, weirdos in the World of Darkness, I would probably give the lore even lower a score because it's not great. And I think also that there's stuff in the second chapter, well, doesn't exactly contradicts other stuff we know. There are occasions where I'm like, I'm not entirely sure this is how it works. And obviously the way that revised edition kind of doesn't, I don't want to say shit on the Anarchs, but kind of push them to the side is very clear in this book. The Anarchs get very little space. They're not even considered a faction, I guess in that regard. They're more like Camarilla Light. So if you're into Anarchs, this book is not very useful for you. Thus, I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. That's the score. 6 because of the appendix, essentially. Because the appendix is probably the most interesting part of the lore in this book. Because honestly, like the tapestry, the Darwin Society, the I don't know, the Cold Man's Children, these are all really cool. And I can tell that there was a lot of thought and fun put into them. They're very tongue-in-cheek. So I think that actually saved this book for me. I think that part was the most interesting to read. So 6 out of 10 for lore. Let's go to Crunch. Crunch, there is some interesting stuff in this book, but in a lot of regards, it fails. Guidelines, absolutely, for Diablerie and for Golconda, and that's where it stops. Guidelines. It's all fluff. There are very little concrete rules about these things. Very little concrete rules about shifting your sect from Sabbat to Camarilla and vice versa, but that stuff's been covered already in those books. There are background traits, and there are, secondary abilities that kind of already do that. So this book just regurgitates a lot of stuff that you would have already absorbed through osmosis if you read some of those books. As for the actual Crunch, the abilities, they're so niche. Like, even before we go into the discipline stuff like that, which I actually have some good things to say about, the paths are really lackluster. They're milquetoast. They feel more like personalities than paths, and honestly, not super hard to follow. And I think you can all agree with me that for a book that's supposed to be about vampire debauchery and like the really dark sides of vampirism, these paths are not good. I can only imagine that Chaining the Beast already got all the good ones, so they're like, all right, what do we have left to throw into this book? And that's where we ended up. I, again, haven't read Chaining the Beast. That's going to be the second book I'm reading, but these 3 paths, I guess if you're playing a character, like I'll get into that when we get to the player usability, but if you want to play a character, or you as a player aren't very social, aren't very outgoing, and kind of just want to be in the background and observe and learn and study, perfect paths for you. They're not super evil, they're pretty reasonable, and obviously they're pretty passive. But for someone who wants to play an inhuman creature that doesn't care about human morality and just, kind of goes their own way, these are pretty milquetoast. The disciplines and the rituals, and, Koldunic sorcery, stuff like that, that's pretty interesting. There's some cool stuff in here that's, although cool, very niche, and sometimes very, situational is the word I'm looking for. Very situational. And I would never just randomly allow someone to use stuff from these books without my input, because they're thematically very dark. I would definitely have to hold a session with all of my players to talk about that. I think I mentioned that in a review as well. Just to be like, okay, is everyone okay with this being in the game? That being said, I can't really tell you if they're overpowered or not. Unfortunately, I'm not that good at the metagame, so you will have to turn to someone else for that. But they're cool, they're thematic, they're definitely better than the paths, that's for sure. And some of the rituals are pretty cool, actually. I really like the one about sharing Diablerie, and that gets quite a bit of explanation for it, so it's clear that they put some thought into that. Others, like the forced abortion ritual, like, why? When is that ever going to happen in my chronicle? It's, like I said, very situational, and yeah, we'll leave it at that. 4 out of 10 is what I'm giving this book for Crunch. Honestly, if we didn't have some of the disciplines in here or the dark thaumaturgy stuff, I would have given it even lower. The Crunch in this book is bad. Let's go on to player usability. So how useful is this book for a player? If I was a player and I got this book, would I get a lot out of it? I did touch upon this previously, but I'll reiterate that if you're a new player and you're expected to know stuff about Vampiric Society, you can do worse than this book. It's going to give you some insight into Diablerie, into the myth of Golconda. It's going to tell you a little bit about sect allegiances and stuff like that. So that's good. The cult part in chapter 3, very, very situational and specific. If you want to play a cult leader, which, in V5 and later editions is definitely a thing you can do, this book is good. It's going to teach you how to run a cult, more or less. Cults of the Blood Gods, on the other hand, which is on its way when this video is being made, is probably going to cover the same stuff. So pick your poison. I would say that for a player, this book is decently useful, but it's not something you would bring to the table in the hopes that it might, like, you would have to talk with your storyteller about all the disciplines and the rituals, because again, they're very much on the darker spectrum of the game, and I think chapter 4, it honestly is the darkest part of this book, and I would have expected more of that stuff. I would not, as a storyteller, allow you to have any of these powers unless we had a long conversation about it, or unless that was like the theme of the game. And even then, I've said it several times, I would never implement this stuff without talking to everyone in the group before that, because yeah, it definitely sets the tone for the Chronicle when you have powers like, oh hey, I can basically make everyone fall into orgasmic torpor. That's, yeah, it's weird, very niche. That being said, and I have to really emphasize this, my problems with this book about themes is not the dark stuff in chapter 4. I have no problem with the stuff in chapter 4. I play Cult. I like Hellraiser. I don't mind that stuff. What I don't like is when they implement real world stuff that happened very recently, killed a lot of people, and just kind of say, oh, vampires did it. Because that really, to me, is tasteless in a bad way. I'm not going to go in too much about it in detail. I think I talked a bit about it in the review as well. But honestly, it's just, come on. We don't need the World of Darkness to have real world dark events that just happened, because like the sarin gas attack of Tokyo was 7 years or even less before this book was written. We don't need that stuff in this game to have it be dark. We can have our own stuff. We can be inspired by these events, absolutely. But let's leave the real world stuff out of it, especially stuff that's really fresh, you know. For our player, I would give this a 5 out of 10. It's niche. If your storyteller tells you that this is going to be the theme of the game, your storyteller's probably going to lend you the book anyway. You can get the PDF. It's got some interesting stuff in it, but it's not something I would be like, yeah, you got to have this on your bookshelf. Not really that kind of book. On the other hand, for a storyteller, I would say this book has more going for it, especially the appendix. I got some inspiration reading this book, not gonna lie. Chapter 1 and 2 didn't really do much for me at all. Chapter 3, again, very situational. It's talking about building a cult, which is useful information. I mean, if I want to have a vampire cult or just a cult appearing in my game, there's going to be a lot of useful information in there. Chapter 4, yeah, how am I going to make my bad guys be even better than the Sabbat? They're going to be infernalists, and they're going to do weird, gross stuff. You know, that kind of stuff is useful for a storyteller, absolutely. Niche, but useful. But where the book really shines is in the appendix. Again, it's tongue-in-cheek. It's hard to play it straight, but I feel like the appendix actually inspired parts of Cults of the Blood Gods, because it's just weird. It's World of Darkness weird. It's Bloodlines weird. It's weird, funny, quirky, but also kind of horrible. So for a storyteller, that actually inspired me a lot. I wouldn't mind having the tapestry showing up in my game and being like, oh, hey, cool, there's tiny writing on the fingerprints of Kindred. What's that all about? And it's also, this book is so niche, and, you know, since it's not very useful for players, chances are very low that some of your players have read this book and know what you're talking about when, like, oh, someone's been peeling off the skin of vampires and preserving it for some weird reason. Now you know, because it's in this book. So Appendix really saved this book. I'm going to actually give it a storyteller usability of 7 out of 10. So that's the highest score I'm giving to this book out of these 5 criteria. And that's because it's actually, the Appendix had me caught. I loved it. Too short, unfortunately. And tonality-wise, out the window. It's old school World of Darkness. It's katanas and trench coats, and it's fun. You know, it's not shock value weird. I was actually looking for specific, like, okay, where is this group going to be, you know, tacky weird? Barely happened. There was some stuff in there, but not a lot. Overall impression of this book, gonna right out the window say it's gonna be a 5 out of 10, because it's very, very uneven. You don't need this book. You're never going to need this book, no matter how long you play Vampire the Masquerade. Much of the stuff that's in this book has been covered in other places. Yeah, it expands on dark thaumaturgy. Doesn't necessarily mean that the stuff that's in here is something you need. It's very niche, very situational, and it's at times very boring. That being said, the art is perfectly fine for what it is. It very rarely suits the text that it's next to. I'm kind of feeling like someone went, okay, what's all the art we haven't used in books yet? Let's just put it in this book. There's nudity for some reason. There's one picture of boobs, but I mean, it's a little darkness. So other than that, it's really not much to talk about. And I would say, again, the writers, I don't know if there was something with the editing or with the, everyone working together. Super uneven. Really doesn't feel like half the content in this book belongs in a book called Sins of the Blood, unless you have a very liberal interpretation of sins. Because when I think Sins of the Blood, I'm thinking about the really depraved stuff. Not a lot of that in this book. Chapter 4 being the exception, of course, talking about dark thaumaturgy and Khaldunic sorcery and stuff like that. But overall, this book is a little bit of a mess. It's not the worst, but it's really not one of the best I've read so far. So no shade on the writers, no shade on anyone actually working on this book. It's 20 years old. It's really never marketed as anything you absolutely need. It just expands on a setting and kind of just rehashes a bunch of stuff that you already knew. I mean, you could have shrunk it down to half the size and it would have probably gotten a better score from me. Yeah, I think honestly that's really all I had to say about this book. So again, thank you very much everyone for watching. If you don't agree with my opinion, you're absolutely welcome to say that or let me know in the comments. I did read this book over a long period of time. This was a slog. I've never had this much trouble reading one book of Vampire the Masquerade, so I think that says a lot about how I felt when reading this. I will be reviewing Chaining the Beast next, because I think that anyway, because I think that's the one that got the second most votes. And hopefully that will have more darker paths, because the ones in this book was milk toast. I will be doing this once a month, hopefully, we'll see. And again, they're very subjective, and I hope you can appreciate that for what it is. It's not me trying to change your opinion about a book. If you like this book, credit to you. I didn't. Personal opinion. And check it out if you want. If you want to get into the really depraved stuff of dark thaumaturgy, making deals with demons, there's worse books out there. If you want to get that, get that. Don't expect your storyteller to be okay with you putting that in your character unless you talk with them, though. And I think that's about it. So, until next time, be careful out there, because Gehenna may soon be upon us. Bye!